Coming up, I'll be speaking with Sean Kershaw, Executive Director of the Citizens League, and Stacy Becker, Policy Analyst. That's next on the St. Paul Forum. Welcome to the St. Paul Forum. I'm John Forde. With me today are Sean Kershaw, Executive Director of the Citizens League, and Stacy Becker, Policy Analyst. Welcome, you guys.
Hi.
What is the Citizens League? I hear that name all the time. It's a big deal. You know, you're a big get. Thanks for coming to our little show.
It's great to be here. We are a 60-year-old policy organization that's a real Minnesota innovation. We bring people together across parties and backgrounds and ideologies to define problems and solve problems in Minnesota. So what we really do is we're able to bring people together as a neutral convener in ways that they can't come together otherwise, and we bring people to the table to help us solve problems in ways that a lot of other policy organizations don't. So over our history, we've come up with things like charter schools, the Minnesota Miracle, Metropolitan Council. All these real Minnesota innovations have come out of our work over 60 years.
It sounds like you provide a safe space. Do you have like a padded room or something to get them in?
Well, the great thing is people are really looking for the invitation more than the padded room, because that's a good question. We have this really unique ability to be, I say we're Switzerland on policy issues, that we can have a conversation around electrical energy and have utilities there and businesses there and environmentalists there and just sort of citizen consumers. On most of these issues, that space is gone. And people are looking to it to come together to actually work on solving problems. And so we're the only place like that that's really left anymore. And so whether it's on taxes like we could talk about today, or on mental health, or health issues or education issues, we're able to bring people together, and again, not just to talk about the issue, but to define it and figure out how we move forward and solve it.
Okay. And Stacy, as a policy analyst, I'm going to use a metaphor here. Is your job to drag Sean into the weeds or keep him out of the weeds? The kind of depthy, nuanced stuff that they delegate, right?
I don't think either.
Okay.
I don't think either. The idea of what we're doing with the Citizens League is really to provide context to issues. It was interesting, about 5 years ago, we were piloting a way of working with citizens on tough issues, and we were asking them about property taxes. And we were told by lots of elected officials, and actually they were asking us, we've been trying so hard to explain property taxes, but we can't explain it to people because it's so complicated. And we were told when we decided we were going to try that, you know, citizens don't care, they're apathetic, they're too ignorant, they won't get it, and we didn't believe all of that. And so what we did, instead of telling people what we think they should know about property taxes, is we went and asked them, what do you want to know? And they told us, well, I'd like to know this, or I'd like to know that. And we came back with the answers, and honest to God, in like 20 minutes, they sat back in their seat and they went, oh, I get it now. And then you can have really great conversations. And so the idea of what we're trying to do is provide a context so that a really impartial information, not trying to spin it either way, make room for everybody's opinions, so that people can learn and then have the kind of discussions that are so missing around almost virtually every policy issue today. And once you start with that, then you can decide how much you want to get into the weeds or not.
Most policy right now suffers from, I mean, there's a whole bunch of problems that it might suffer from. It doesn't involve people who really who experience the problem in defining it. So, I mean, one of the stories we tell is we'll go out and ask an audience, who's the last group ever to be involved in conversations around high school reform? And it's always the high school students, even though they have all sorts of knowledge and insights and the ability to impact their world. So that happens a lot of times in policy, or in the work we're doing right now on taxes. You don't go out and really talk to people to understand what are their values and priorities, that some of the issues in the budget and taxes are technical and about numbers, but below those are questions about people's values and priorities. And you might have the best idea in the world about reform or about change, but if you don't understand how to connect to people's values and priorities, it's usually not going to go anywhere. And the Citizens League, and in our work together, I think has done a really good job of trying to define problems better and understand what will really move these from ideas into reality.
Can I jump in
Sure.
there? Because I think this is such an important point. You can take almost any policy issue, and it starts with some kind of a value or priority that citizens bring to it. Even I used to be the head of Public Works in St. Paul. And even something like how often do you pave the street? We make assumptions about that as, you know, the technical folks paving the street. But we don't really go out and ask people like, well, do you want to pay this much to have it paved every 10 years? How much is it worth it? How important to you? And I'm not saying we should go and ask on all these kinds of things. But when it gets to big policy issues, we often make assumptions about what citizens want. So for example, a couple of years ago, there was a big effort around how we do redistricting in Minnesota so that people can vote. And the idea was that elections are not competitive enough. They need to be, if you're an incumbent, you pretty much win the election. So a bunch of folks got together and decided we need a new law to make elections more competitive. And we, the Citizens League, asked them, well, do you know if that's what citizens want? And they said, I have no idea.
But we want it.
Yeah,
And it turns out, we asked, and it turns out that the Minnesotans we talked to, when it came to the Minnesota legislature, did not necessarily want it to be more competitive. They want the congressional ones to be more competitive. So we make all these big technical, we have these big technical discussions without really starting with citizens. What's important to you? What kind of state do you want to live in? What kind of values should we assign to health or taxes or whatever? We just go off and do the technical stuff. And that's the level that typically we engage citizens at. And then we're mad because they don't get the weeds like you talked about. So what we try not to do is drag the citizens into all the weeds. We've got experts to know that stuff. We're asking citizens, what's important to you here? And then you let the experts figure out how to get to that goal.
It sounds like what you're doing is kind of research, but are you also doing almost a cultivation to increase citizen participation?
Yeah, the two go hand in hand, because if we don't increase citizens' understanding of issue and their awareness of it and that sort of political landscape, it's hard to get change through. I mean, a lot of people assume that you can just go up to the legislature and pass a law and all these things happen. And the nature of our problems is different than it used to be, and it's hard to do that. And the legislature is not as, it's harder to get work done there than it was in the past. And what we're finding on these issues is until you go out and head and understand where our citizens, what are their values, what are their priorities, help them understand the trends that are happening. One of the most fun conversations we're having is simply around demographics. Here's what's changing, and apply that then to long-term care financing or all sorts of other issues. And that when people get a sense of what the changes are in the demographics and how that's changing, they're able to understand oftentimes the policy changes that you need as well. So it's a combination of getting out there ahead, cultivation, creating that climate, and then working to back it up with policies that you need.
Okay. One of the reasons we brought you here is to talk about your initiative about tax fairness. And as you go out, what are you finding out that people are saying about tax fairness? How do they feel? You know, it's really more of a gut check, isn't it?
Well, you know, it's kind of interesting because all the wordy stuff, whatever you want to call it. Oh, you know, we want tax fairness. Well, of course you do. I mean, who's going to go out and say we want unfair taxes, right? I mean, that doesn't say a whole lot. The question is, what does that mean? What does it mean for taxes
Literally,
to be fair?
what does it mean?
Literally, I mean, really. And so we've been out talking to people in Minnesota because there is going to be a reform proposal made this January by the governor. So we've been out asking people what's important in taxes to you, and specifically, what does fairness mean to you? And it's really interesting because, you know, some of the first things that happen is people will go, well, we can't answer this because fairness means something different to all different people. And our point is we ought to understand, what do Minnesotans mean, what does fairness mean to them? And what we're finding is some kind of interesting answers. The most important thing that fairness means is that I get value for my money that I'm spending.
It's more transactional than ethical.
Well, what's interesting about, and so what's interesting about that is actually that's even kind of on the budget and how we do reform and budget size. It doesn't say who bears what burden or whatnot, but this is the biggest thing almost across the political spectrums of people. It's fair if I get something in return.
And so if we think about this and sort of stand above it, everybody agrees across the landscape that we need tax reform. I mean, that the system we have isn't sustainable, it's not capturing our economic growth. I mean, there's all these reasons there's agreement that there needs to be change. There's enormous disagreement about the nature of that change, but everybody says it has to be fair. And yet nobody goes out and really asks, what does fairness mean? And I think what Stacy just mentioned is a great example, that sometimes in these conversations, there's this, you don't want to romanticize citizens, but there's this wisdom that emerges that's really, really useful. So that what citizens clearly told us in this project is part of what fairness is in taxes, which is me giving money to the government, is do I believe I'm getting value on the services back to me?
Or even, let me just amend that, because someone pointed this out. It's not even that I'm getting money, services back directly to me, but society as a whole is that we're getting good value. We're getting common good out of the tax money we're paying. And it's kind of interesting because we always in our sessions, first of all, we try to make them really fun. They're very interactive. We give folks information. And one of the interesting things that happens when we talk about taxes is we'll show people, here's your total state and local tax bill. Here's how much you are likely to pay in income taxes, in sales taxes, in property taxes, in gas taxes, the whole bit. And people will look at it and they'll go, but what about all those people who don't pay taxes that we keep hearing? The 47%.
Yeah.
Wait a minute, how is it that everybody can be paying taxes? There's so much confusion around
And
this issue.
misinformation.
The 47% is federal income taxes. But if you look at state and local taxes, virtually every Minnesotan pays taxes. You just do. By virtue of, if I buy a bottle of water, I'm going to pay, well, maybe not water, because food's not, but you pay sales taxes. And so when folks start to see, oh, everybody's paying taxes. Now, who's paying more and who's paying less? And those are the conversations we start to have around how should this tax burden be shared. And I think what we're finding out there is there's some common ground, but there's a lot more conversation that needs to be held around that yet.
Now, one of the important, if I could step back even again, you mentioned research. One of the important functions that we play in these conversations is to distill what the key information is. So we spend a lot of time testing information to see what really seems to be useful to people, because on an issue like this, you could be flooded with research and data. There's not always agreement on what is actually data. I mean, we know from the political landscape right now, there's a lot of disagreement about what a fact is, but there's also disagreement about even if everyone agrees that's an actual number, is it useful in this conversation? So one of the most important roles that we play in these conversations is to say, we've done research, we've looked at numbers, we've talked with people across the political spectrum, and they believe this background information is true and relevant. And immediately people feel less defensive or like they're being spun, so that they can have these conversations about, okay, what does that mean to you? What do you value? What would you want to prioritize? So even before the conversation begins, there's a lot of time we have to put into not so much the deep research, but distilling that research down to what matters, because that allows people to participate in ways that they might not otherwise.
And we really try in the way we have the conversation to make sure that there's room for everybody, that we make clear that there's going to be disagreements, right? Because these are tough issues. People have, very strong feelings around a lot of these issues. But it's the value of, and we ask people afterwards, did you learn anything by listening to your fellow, citizens? And they almost always say yes, that it was really helpful in having them think through the issues. And there was a case up in, I think it was Hibbing. There were 4 people at a table, and 3 were quite liberal, and 1 was conservative, and they were just kind of like sniping at each other the whole night. And then at the end, they found out that they all had something in common. They were all from mining families. And it was like all that rancor kind of just melted.
Yeah.
And they were able to start having these really great conversations about, what matters with budget and taxes.
Good, okay. In case you're just joining us, this is the St. Paul Forum. I'm John Forde. With me today is Sean Kershaw, Executive Director of the Citizens League, and Stacy Becker, a policy analyst. Now, Sean, you were mentioning the background information that you give people sometimes, and we talked about the broad sweeps. I mean, you can tax, income, you can tax assets, you can tax consumption.
Right.
what's missing from that list, and how do you present that to people in a way that isn't almost making like a push-pull?
Yeah, I mean, part of what we do, and Stacy has more experience with it, is first of all, we make sure that the research we put out there is not asking people trick questions. This isn't a quiz. It's not meant to be gotcha. So it's not, do you know where your taxes come from? And it's also meant to really identify what we think the important trends are. So for example, there are literally hundreds of different types of taxes in Minnesota, but we put up a pie chart that says they basically fall into these buckets. Here's your property taxes, here's your income tax, here's sales tax, here's other things, so that people are able to get a landscape of it and draw it. I mean, we're careful that we don't try and draw conclusions for them, but we do try and distill what do we think is the most important information, and what's the format that makes that easiest for people to understand and pick up and talk with. Because again, we're not there to tell them what to think, but to give them the basis that allows them to talk with each other.
Where something's particularly controversial, we'll tell them both sides. But we try really hard, and as you know with data, if you're looking at a trend, for example, the year you pick can really alter the trend. So we really go through and work it hard to see that we're providing something that's as possibly impartial as can be.
One of the nice things, the reasons that this is important is to the Citizens League, because we're not ideological and we're not single issue. If we get off base on the facts, we're in trouble. So we have a natural need to make sure that they're objective and relevant and useful for people. So we don't gain anything by trying to spin, or if people catch an error, we immediately correct it. But what happens in 99% of the conversation is they're so glad not to argue about the facts that they can actually talk about what they mean.
And I think the most important thing we do, and this is what we learn from citizens with that property tax conversation, is we try to put it in a context. There's a bajillion numbers out there, and places will go, well, we put the whole budget on the website, but what does that mean? So we try to give the numbers in a picture. What might this mean? What does it look like over 50 years? How does it compare to other states? And so always give a context so that it's not just a number. What does 10 mean? Well, it's like, or my example is if someone said, is $10 enough for dinner? I would say, I don't know. Are you going to McDonald's or a fancy steakhouse? You have to provide a context, and that's what we try hard to do at the same time, keeping it unbiased.
Now, there's the strong possibility of tax reform coming up in the legislature next year. And with your objective stance, in what sense are you pushing? Are you pushing not on a policy specifically, but to just raise the level of information, or?
It's both. In the cases of taxes, we do have a position on certain aspects of tax reform. So over the course of our recent history, we've taken a position on something we call tax expenditures. And these are items in the state tax code that the state says, people can keep it. So the best example is sales tax on food and clothing. The state says we would normally tax this, but we're exempting it. So they from the collection. So we have a position on that issue. But on a lot of these issues of reform, a lot of these issues right now, we're trying to inform the conversation that will happen with the governor, with the legislature, and with policymakers broadly, and with the public as well, because it's going to be really difficult to put through any change on tax reform that somebody wants unless the public is both led about why it matters and engaged in that conversation, and that the leaders understand where the public's coming from and their priorities.
Okay. Tell us about your Common Sense initiative.
Yeah.
So
go for it.
So this is a series that we do with public, with the citizens. We've got one on trying to balance the state budget, and another one on if you were going to do tax reform, how would you do it? And they both work in a very similar manner. We give a little bit of information, and then we have people discuss questions like, what does fairness mean in taxes? And then we use these little clicker kind of advices, and we give them choices, and they can tell us their answer. And it works really great because people love seeing what does everybody else think. And also using the clickers makes me engage in a whole different level, because now I have to tell you that I had been running these, we call them workshops, for I had done many of them, and one night not too many people showed up, so I decided to participate along with everybody else. Oh my gosh, it was so much harder to actually have to answer the questions. I was like, oh, this is really hard. So having to click actually engages your brain and your mind at a whole nother level and has you think through the trade-offs. And people are just great. I'm waiting for the time when I say, okay, here's a question, and now we're going to sit down and discuss it. And people are just going to look at me and go, who's going to discuss it? Not me. But they always do. And they love it. Whether it sounds really dry and boring, budget and taxes, but people just love getting the information. They have amazing questions, amazing insights. And every time I do it, I learn more. So it's really anywhere from an hour to 2 hours, depending on the setting, where we give information and then get back people's viewpoints on these issues as they discuss it with their colleagues.
And over time, I mean, people always talk about the fact that budgets are a reflection of your priorities, and they are. And at the state level, they're a reflection of the state's priorities. And when we're in these times where what people see are government shutdown, they see partisan arguments, and they see gridlock, without really understanding, I think, the dynamics that are behind that, whether they agree with the gridlock or either side. And so it allows us to go in, like Stacy said, inform them about here's the trends, here's why it's happening. I mean, for example, we talk about the fact that expenses are going up at a certain amount, revenue is going up less than that. That explains the fact that we have a regular gap almost every budget session. But people quickly engage and start to draw bigger pictures, conclusions and findings from that. So when we look at a whole series of conversations together, you see trends about what the public wants. So their appetite for reform, they're insistent on long-term reform. A picture begins to emerge of what matters to the public that's important for policymakers to understand. Because policymakers might be facing a choice of saying, do I do something that's in the long-term interest of the state but is in the short term there's pain, or do I go with the short-term gain and pass the buck down the road? I mean, we're learning very clearly that the public wants the long term here, but there's not necessarily the opportunity for the conversation.
Well, and I want to say something really important, because sometimes people go, well, why don't you just do a poll? It's not a poll. I get a phone call, 5 o'clock, I want to eat dinner, and off the top of my head. Here, people are given information, they engage with one another, they're very thoughtful. They, as I mentioned, they'll say that this table conversation helped them think through the issues. It's a whole nother level of getting at where the public is really at. It allows people to think through things in a way that we think there's a real appetite out there for, yet rarely the opportunity.
Now, the Citizens League is a nonprofit, and so we can promote you.
Yes, promote away.
And now, these common sense events, how many are there? Where are they? How can people participate?
We've got a couple coming up, one on November 7th that would be great for the listeners to participate in. And you can participate, I think the easiest way is to go to our website. So it's citizensleague.org is the website to go to. And you can learn, we have several events coming up on that, but most immediately on November 7th. People can sign up for it there, they can learn about it, they can invite other friends to join. I do have to say, people leave surprised that they had such a good time talking about something that you might perceive as dry, but people are talking about kitchen tables, they're talking about the water coolers. So what we're doing in these events is really capturing the conversations that are already taking place and really trying to focus them.
And are you having them all around the state? Is it metro, or how do you take the temperature of the whole state?
It's really important in these that we do get throughout the state. So in the Common Sense Project, we've had, 40 conversations, 30 to 40 conversations, and we've gone throughout the state to do that. So we will take this show to communities in greater Minnesota, have the conversation there. The immediate conversations we have coming up are going to be in the metro area and in St. Paul.
We also have an online component, which you can also find through the Citizens League, where people can go. You can find this property tax that I mentioned if you want to know your full, or not property tax, your full state and local tax bill. We've got a little thing easy to use online that you can find out. You can weigh in on different tax proposals. So there's an online way to learn about some of this and put your 2 cents in as well.
It sounds like a lot of what the Citizens League does is open dialogues. And do you get politicians coming to you saying, I want a piece of that, let me be part of it?
I mean, the great thing about the Citizens League's history is that it's turned these dialogues, and it originally, its real breakthrough was bringing citizens into the policy process in order to reform things. And so over the time, as they built up credibility and relevance, we had enormous impact on the system. Now we're changing the way we do that business to reflect the fact that the world has changed. But we are finding that politicians, elected officials, formal policy leaders are hungry to watch these conversations, to see that they've happened. We've had legislators show up.
To be part of them.
To be a part of it.
They participate just like everybody else, and they love it. And it's really nice because it takes them off the hot seat.
Yeah.
They don't have to stand up there and answer. They can just discuss with everybody else. And so they tend to really enjoy them.
And it helps the public understand the real tough questions that the elected officials have to take. That when you're discussing these issues, they feel that, I think they're bringing the public into the nature of that discussion. And again, the goal here is not just to have the conversation, but to inform the public, inform policy leaders, formal policy leaders, in a way that allows us to make policy change over time.
Okay. We only have about 1 minute left. Is there anything else that I've missed that you want to go over, that you want to promote or
I think
say?
certainly I'd be in the promotion. I mean, if people hear this and they would like to have one of these conversations in their community, at their business, we're having many of these conversations on business sites, and it's amazing how people use that opportunity to engage.
Or
at
organizations. If you're
Yeah.
part of an organization that meets regularly, let us know. We can come and do one of these conversations.
Okay. And you know, a lot of Silicon Valley startups have what they call the secret sauce. Your secret sauce seems to be fun. How do you bring so much fun into something that seems kind of arcane and dry on the surface?
Well, it's because it's about what people care about, and if you don't find a way of sort of having the common good be a good time, we're not going to get this work done. And so it's a value of ours that this work is inherently important and difficult, so you need to find ways to bring out the joy in it. But people are excited about that.
And I think we genuinely believe in what people have to tell us. We genuinely, when we go out and do these, it is always fun, they're always wonderful, they're always insightful. And so it creates a little magic moment, if you will, every time we do them.
And you've got to experience it to believe it. So I would really encourage the people who are watching to go if they can, or invite us into their communities.
Well, thank you very much. Sean Kershaw and Stacy Becker. We've been talking about the Citizens League on the St. Paul Forum. Come join us again next week. Thank you very much.